At the reading of my mother's will, she handed my younger sister $30 million, the entire family company, and every valuable property we owned. And me. At 58, I was left with a few dusty old ceramics and one cold, humiliating message: I had never been worthy of leadership. The whole room fell silent. My sister and her husband could barely hide their smug smiles. In their minds, I had lost everything. Decades of sacrifice, endless work, and loyalty. All of it meant nothing. But I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I simply stood there and watched them sign the inheritance papers with shaking excitement. Because what they didn't know was that the fortune they were celebrating was never a blessing. It was a trap. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat and pressed a small silver button on the desk. The heavy curtains in the conference room slid shut automatically, casting a cool shadow over the massive mahogany table. The large flat-screen monitor on the wall flickered to life. My mother, Beatrice, appeared on the screen. She was seated in an expensive velvet armchair in the sunroom of her estate. Even though she had only weeks left to live, she still looked absolutely flawless. Her silver hair was sprayed into perfect place, and she wore a custom-made silk blouse with a string of real pearls. She stared directly into the camera, her eyes as cold and sharp as they had been for my entire life. She did not begin the video by saying she loved us. She did not offer a single warm piece of motherly advice. She simply looked straight ahead and delivered her final judgment. To my youngest daughter, Savannah, I leave the entirety of Caldwell Foods, the Malibu estate, and $30 million in cash. Savannah is the true heir to the Caldwell family legacy. She has always possessed the grace, the vision, and the social standing to carry our family name into the future. I sat perfectly still, staring at the screen. 30 years. I had given Caldwell Foods 30 years of my blood and sweat. When I was 28, I took over a collapsing supply chain and turned it into a national empire. I was the one who woke up at 4 a.m. to negotiate with overseas vendors. I was the one who walked across the freezing concrete floors of the meatpacking plants while my mother and sister spent their days at country clubs and charity galas. I sacrificed my own personal life because my mother convinced me it was my duty to the family. And now, with just a few simple words, she was handing my entire life's work to a woman whose biggest daily struggle was deciding which pair of designer shoes to wear. The video continued. My mother paused, and her expression hardened. "And to Vivian," she said, her voice lowering with deep disappointment, "I leave my collection of vintage ceramics. You have always been a hard worker, Vivian, but you never had the mind of a true leader. You are a worker, not a visionary. I hope you will respect my final wishes and cause no trouble for your sister. You have always been a disappointment, but I hope that at the very least you will know enough to remain silent." The screen suddenly went black. The silence in the room was suffocating. Savannah let out one loud theatrical breath. She pressed her perfectly manicured hand to her chest and turned to her husband, Marcus. Marcus leaned back in his heavy leather chair and let out a booming laugh. He actually clapped right in front of me. Then he looked across the table at my worn old blazer and smirked. "Well, Viv," he sneered, his voice dripping with thick arrogance, "I guess the gravy train has officially left the station. You'd better start cleaning out your desk." Marcus leaned his massive frame across the polished mahogany table. He was wearing a custom-tailored dark blue suit that probably cost more than my first car. He rested his elbows on the wood and stared at me with a look of complete disgust. His eyes traveled up and down my sensible gray blazer. It was a good quality jacket, but it was over a decade old. The cuffs were slightly frayed. The elbows were worn thin from years of resting on cold metal desks in the shipping warehouses. He let out a low, mocking chuckle that echoed in the quiet room. "Look at yourself, Viv," he said, shaking his head slowly. "You look like you just crawled out of a charity bin. The ride is over. Savannah is the boss now, and she does not want you stinking up the corporate office with your depressing energy. You are bad for the brand." He reached into his perfectly pressed trousers and pulled out a sleek leather wallet. He slid a crisp $100 bill across the table. It came to rest right in front of me. "Take this and call a cab," he told me. "Go back to your little apartment and start packing. We are going to need the keys to your penthouse by tomorrow morning. We have important partners flying in from New York, and we need that space to entertain real investors." I did not touch the money. I just looked down at my own hands resting on my lap. My knuckles were swollen. My skin was dry and lined with deep creases that no expensive lotion could ever erase. There was a faded white scar across the back of my left hand. I got that scar 20 years ago when I was helping unload a delayed shipment of frozen goods at our main facility in Chicago at 3 a.m. Our union workers had gone on strike, and I was the only executive who actually rolled up her sleeves and stepped onto the freezing concrete floor to make sure the inventory did not spoil. I spent 30 years sacrificing my youth and my health for Caldwell Foods. I negotiated with ruthless suppliers. I balanced the budgets when my mother secretly drained the corporate accounts to buy racehorses. I saved the company from Chapter 11, bankruptcy 3 separate times. My hands were the hands of a woman who had carried the weight of an entire empire on her shoulders. Then I looked across the table at Savannah. She was tapping her fingers impatiently against the armrest of her chair. Her hands were flawless. Her skin was smooth and glowing from weekly spa treatments. Her nails were painted a perfect shade of pale pink and adorned with tiny embedded diamonds. On her left ring finger, she wore a massive emerald-cut diamond ring. Marcus had bought her that ring 10 years ago using a massive bonus he received from my mother, a bonus he got for a phantom consultant job he never actually did. Savannah had never worked a single day in her 48 years of life. She had never stepped foot inside a packing plant. She did not know the names of our distributors or the profit margins of our best-selling products. She only knew how to spend the money that I killed myself to make. "You really should take the money," Vivian Savannah said softly. Her voice dripped with fake sympathy. "It is the least we can do. You have always struggled so much with your finances. Mother knew you lacked the sophistication to handle massive wealth. That is why she put me in charge. I know it hurts your pride, but you have to accept reality. You were a good worker bee, but the company needs modern leadership now. Marcus is going to take Caldwell Foods public. We are moving into the future, and you are just a piece of the past." I sat there and listened to them rewrite history. I listened to this arrogant man and my spoiled sister reduce my 3 decades of blood and sweat into nothing. They actually believed they were the brilliant ones. They believed my mother was a genius for handing them the keys to the kingdom. They looked at my frayed sleeves and my tired eyes and thought they had defeated me. The pressure in the room was suffocating. Anyone else would have cried. Anyone else would have screamed or thrown the $100 bill back in his face. But I did not. I felt a cold, absolute calm wash over me. I let them talk. I let them dig their graves deeper with every arrogant word they spoke. The more they insulted me, the more satisfying their ultimate destruction would be. I kept my eyes locked on the $100 bill on the table, and I waited for the perfect moment to strike. Savannah flipped her perfect blonde hair over her shoulder and tapped her diamond-covered fingers against the mahogany table. She was already bored with having to sit in the same room as me. Then she turned to Mr. Harrison with the smug expression of a woman who believed she had just hit the jackpot. "All right, Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice sharp with impatience and command. "We've watched that sentimental little video, and I have a spa appointment at 2. So hand me the papers so I can sign for my $30 million. Caldwell Foods needs a new president, someone who actually knows how to dress and spend money." Mr. Harrison did not react to her rudeness. The 64-year-old lawyer calmly opened his leather briefcase and took out a thick stack of documents, crisp white pages, yellow tabs marking every signature line. He laid them carefully on the table and slid them towards Savannah. "These are the full inheritance documents, Ms. Savannah," Mr. Harrison said in a flat, emotionless tone. "They include the transfer of the company, the real estate holdings, and all financial accounts connected to Mrs. Beatrice Caldwell. You will need to sign in 3 places to formally accept the entirety of the estate." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes glowing with greed. "Sign it, baby," he urged, shoving a gold fountain pen into his wife's hand. "We'll take the jet to Paris tonight to celebrate. And make sure you order the most expensive champagne they have." Savannah grabbed the pen. She didn't read the first page. She didn't glance at the clauses or the attached addendums. In her mind, There was only one thing, $30 million, and the pleasure of throwing me out with nothing. Just as the gold tip of her pen was about to touch the paper, I spoke. "Are you sure, Savannah?" My voice was calm, clear, almost too calm for the silence in that room. She froze. The pen hovered exactly an inch above the page. Then she lifted her head and looked at me, her bright red lips curling into a sneer so full of contempt it was almost theatrical. "Sure about what, Vivian?" she shot back cruelly. "Sure that I'm rich and you're left with nothing?" "Of course I'm sure." "Is this your last pathetic little attempt at jealousy?" I didn't blink. I didn't move. I looked straight into her eyes and repeated myself slowly and precisely. "I'm simply asking whether you're absolutely certain you want to accept everything Mother left behind, everything without leaving a single thing untouched." She let out a shrill, ugly laugh. Marcus laughed too, the hollow, arrogant laugh of a man who had never built anything in his life. "You really are pathetic," Vivian Savannah said, shaking her head. "Do you think I'm going to leave you a quarter of a house, a few $1,000s? No, Vivian. I want all of it. The $30 million is mine. Your penthouse is mine. Caldwell Foods is mine. And you are not getting a single cent from me." Then she drove the pen down onto the paper. The scratching sound of ink across the page was loud in the stillness. She signed 3 times in bold, oversized strokes, each signature sprawling across the page like a monument to her greed. When she finished, she tossed the pen onto the table, folded her arms, and lifted her chin at me in triumph. "There," she declared. "It's done. Everything Mother owned now belongs to me. You have no authority here anymore." I looked down at the signatures, the ink still wet, and a cold, deep satisfaction slid through my spine. She had just placed the noose around her own neck with her own hand, and she had no idea. She thought she had just claimed a fortune. What she had really accepted was a time bomb, and I was the one holding the trigger. I rose slowly from the heavy leather chair. I didn't bother looking at the papers on the table again. Savannah's rushed signatures were already dry, and that was all I needed. I reached for my old leather handbag and carefully slipped it over my shoulder. By then, the air in the conference room was thick with their ridiculous gloating. Marcus had already pulled out his phone and was scrolling through the inventory of a luxury car dealership. He was even whistling some bland little tune under his breath. Savannah, meanwhile, was admiring her own reflection in her phone screen, already murmuring to herself about who she would invite to the celebration party that night. They ignored my existence completely, just as they had ignored my sweat, my sacrifice, and my tears for the last 30 years. Mr. Harrison looked at me over the rim of his reading glasses. There was something unreadable in his eyes, something steady and quiet. I gave him the smallest nod in return. Just one neat, controlled nod to confirm that everything had gone exactly according to plan. "I hope you both have a wonderful day," I said calmly. My voice did not shake. There was no anger in it, not even a trace. Savannah didn't bother looking up. She simply flicked her hand at me as if she were shooing away a fly. "Don't forget to clear out your things before noon tomorrow," she said carelessly. I turned and walked out of the mahogany conference room straight into the marble hallway beyond. Marcus's triumphant laughter still echoed behind the closing door. They truly believed they had just thrown a poor, washed-up old woman out onto the street. What they didn't know was that the only thing my mother had really left behind was not $30 million in cash. She had left a black hole of debt, and Savannah had just signed her name to every last cent of it. I stepped into the elevator and slowly pressed the button for the ground floor. The doors slid shut, cutting off the noise behind me. The game wasn't over. It was only just beginning. At 7 o'clock the next morning, the violent pounding on the door shattered the silence of the penthouse. I was sitting on the old leather sofa, sipping black coffee. I had been awake since 4 a.m. and had already packed the few things I truly needed into a small gray suitcase. Everything else in that massive apartment, the expensive artwork, the oak dining set, every polished symbol of wealth I left behind. None of it meant anything to me anymore. The double mahogany doors flew open. Marcus stormed in wearing a bright red designer tracksuit and black sunglasses, even though it was still early morning. Behind him came 3 large men in black suits built like walls of muscle. Debt collectors, the kind of men he had probably hired just for this performance. Marcus clapped his hands 3 times, the sound exploding through the huge living room. "Rise and shine, old lady," he shouted arrogantly. "Everything in this apartment now belongs to Caldwell Foods, which means it belongs to my wife, and I'm here to clear out the garbage of the past." I set my coffee cup down on the glass table. I did not look surprised. I did not look afraid. I simply watched him strut across the expensive wool rug toward my walnut desk in the corner, the desk where I had spent countless sleepless nights signing contracts that saved the company while he and Savannah partied on tropical islands. Marcus picked up a crystal statue commemorating the company's 20th anniversary and turned it over in his massive hand. He smirked, then suddenly let it drop. It hit the marble floor and shattered into hundreds of glittering pieces. The crack of breaking glass rang through the room, but I never blinked. "Oops," he said with a fake shrug. "Slipped. Then again, it's cheap junk, just like the woman who owned it." The 3 bodyguards folded their arms and grinned. Marcus kept going, sweeping old files, fountain pens, and framed photos off my desk and onto the floor. He was trying to provoke me. He wanted me to cry, beg, or lunge at him so he could unleash his thugs. But I only sat there leaning back against the sofa, watching his violent little tantrum like it was beneath me. I had gone head-to-head with the most ruthless business predators in America. A pathetic man living off his wife's money could never shake me. Then his eyes landed on my silver laptop sitting on the desk. It was old, scratched, and worn from years of traveling with me through freezing warehouses and factory floors. What Marcus didn't know was that inside that hard drive were the master access codes to the financial core I controlled. It was the real heart of the empire. It was also the one tool capable of controlling the $35 million of debt his wife had so foolishly signed for. Marcus lifted the laptop with 2 fingers as if it disgusted him. "And what about this pile of scrap?" he sneered, turning to his hired men. "You planning to take this antique to the nursing home with you, Viv? We're using cutting-edge technology here now, not prehistoric trash. My wife's replacing every outdated piece of equipment with the newest models." He didn't wait for an answer. He swung his arm and hurled the laptop onto the floor right near the toe of my shoe. A hard metallic crack snapped through the room. One corner of the aluminum shell bent on impact. "Time to get out," he ordered, jerking his chin toward the front door. "My boys will escort you all the way to the sidewalk to make sure you don't steal anything valuable from my family. Don't make me throw you out myself." I rose slowly. Then I bent down and picked up the laptop. The outer shell was dented, but I already knew the memory inside was safe. He had no idea he had just tossed away the key to a fortune and forced me to carry his family's financial death sentence out of the building myself. I took a small cloth, wiped the dust from the laptop, and gently slipped it into my old leather bag. Then I reached for my small gray suitcase. Its wheels rolled softly across the marble floor, making a calm, steady sound. I walked past Marcus. He was much taller than I was, but the moment I passed him, something cold in my silence made him take one involuntary step backward. Confusion flickered across his face for half a second before his arrogance returned. "I hope you and Savannah enjoy the apartment," I said quietly, without turning around. "And be careful with the broken glass on the floor. It's sharper than you think." I walked out the door, leaving 30 years of my youth and sacrifice behind me. 2 bodyguards followed close behind, escorting me down to the lobby like I was some kind of criminal. The receptionist looked at me with pity, but no one dared say a word. When I stepped through the building's revolving glass doors, the cold morning wind brushed across my face. I took one long, deep breath. I felt no grief, no regret, no heartbreak, only freedom. The cruel game had already been set in motion, and those greedy fools were living through the final golden hours of their victory before the bomb of debt exploded and destroyed everything. The taxi dropped me off in front of a rundown 3-star motel on the rough outskirts of Chicago. Its neon sign flickered nonstop, but it was exactly where I needed to be. I walked to the front desk and paid cash for a tiny, shabby room for 3 nights. It was the perfect move. I knew Savannah and Marcus would absolutely have someone watching me. They needed to see me broken. They needed the satisfaction of imagining me rotting away in a damp little room just to feed their oversized egos. I unlocked room 204, set my gray suitcase down on the cheap carpet, and sat on the stiff mattress. Then I pulled out my silver laptop, powered it on, and connected to my own private secure network. Less than 5 minutes later, my screen lit up. An automatic email had just been sent to every employee at Caldwell Foods. It came from Savannah's new presidential account. I clicked it open. The message was only 3 short sentences long, announcing a leadership restructuring. And with one reckless click, my foolish little sister had fired the company's 3 most senior executives: the head of supply chain, the chief operating officer, and the chief financial officer. 3 loyal men who had spent thousands of sleepless nights beside me, keeping the refrigerated trucks moving on time and the contracts profitable. They were the real pillars holding the Caldwell empire upright. And on her very first morning in power, Savannah threw them out simply because they were loyal to me. 30 years of building the right team crushed in less than 12 hours. At the very same time in downtown Chicago, Savannah and Marcus were spending money like maniacs. The accounting system hidden inside my laptop kept feeding me alert after alert as massive charges hit the company's black cards. They had rented out the rooftop of one of the most expensive 5-star restaurants in the city for a lavish takeover celebration. I could picture the whole disgusting scene perfectly. Savannah was probably wearing a crystal-covered evening gown raising a $1,000 glass of champagne, while her empty-headed friends showered her with fake praise. Marcus was no doubt puffing on an expensive Cuban cigar, bragging to every man in the room about what a brilliant investor he had become. He was even using the company card to buy Rolex watches for his closest friends. He thought he was a king on his first day of rule. They were flaunting power by burning money. They were firing the most capable employees and replacing them with flatterers and incompetents. They were smashing apart the smooth-running system of a multi-million-dollar empire with their own hands. To anyone looking in from the outside, it would have seemed like I had lost everything, like my life was over, like the villains had won in spectacular fashion. But sitting there in that filthy motel room watching those enormous charges pile up on my screen, I wasn't angry. I smiled. A quiet, cold smile. The smile of a hunter watching the prey walk willingly into the trap. Every glass of champagne they drank, every Rolex they bought, every obscene dollar they spent was being added to the federal debt of $35 million. Savannah thought that black card was linked to the company's cash. She had no idea the company accounts had been empty for 10 years, and the gigantic credit line she was swiping so recklessly, that money was mine. My personal capital funneled through an anonymous financial corporation no one in the family even knew existed. "Enjoy it while you can, little sister," I whispered to myself, because this party would be the last celebration of your life. The peak of arrogance always comes in the final moment before collapse. At the most luxurious restaurant in Chicago, Savannah and Marcus's celebration had reached its loudest and most expensive stage. Costly champagne flowed endlessly through glittering crystal towers. Music pounded across the windy rooftop, while fake laughter echoed in every corner. Marcus had actually climbed onto a chair, raising his glass in a grand toast to himself for becoming the new king of the Caldwell business empire. He promised to elevate all his useless friends to a whole new level. Loud enough for everyone to hear, he declared that the reign of a bitter old woman was finally over and that true greatness had arrived. Savannah, meanwhile, was gleefully bragging to her empty-headed girlfriends that the very next day she would hire contractors to tear apart my entire office. She wanted to turn the room that had once been the command center of the supply chain into her personal dressing suite and private minibar. She shrieked with laughter as she described how I had been forced to leave the building with my pathetic suitcase like some kind of thief. They were drowning in a fantasy of power, and they had no idea that with every passing second, an invisible noose was tightening around their necks. Then the restaurant manager approached the main table. He wore an elegant black suit, carried himself with perfect professionalism, and held a small black leather folder in one hand. Leaning down slightly, he spoke into Marcus's ear. "Your bill for this evening, sir. The total is $200,000. Would you like to take care of it now?" Marcus burst out laughing, a loud, smug laugh meant to impress everyone around him. "200,000, he boomed, making sure the entire rooftop could hear. "That's pocket change. Bring us 3 more bottles of the most expensive red wine in the cellar while you're at it." Then he pulled the black corporate credit card from inside his dinner jacket, the heavy metal Caldwell Foods card he had stolen control of that very morning. He tossed it onto the silver tray with a gesture so arrogant it was almost theatrical. "Run it, my friend," he said with a sneer, "and leave yourself a $20,000 tip." The manager nodded politely and walked away with the card. The music kept playing. Marcus poured more champagne. He wrapped an arm around the waists of the young women clustered around him. The party kept spinning in its drunken, glittering orbit. But 5 minutes later, the manager returned. This time, he wasn't alone. 2 large security men in black came with him. And the manager's face was no longer warm or deferential. He walked straight to Marcus and placed the black metal card back on the wooden table in front of him. "I'm very sorry, sir," he said in a calm but firm voice, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "Your card has been declined." The table fell silent. Savannah's high-pitched laughter died instantly. She turned to her husband with a look of shock and growing irritation. Marcus frowned, picked up the card, and stared at it like it had betrayed him. "What the hell are you talking about?" he snapped. "This is a top-tier corporate card. It has no spending limit. Your machine is obviously broken. Run it again, and this time do it properly." The manager didn't blink. "We've already tried 3 times, sir. The banking system shows that the card has been locked and is unable to process payment. You'll need to use another form of payment. The $200,000 must be settled immediately." Marcus's face turned scarlet. The alcohol, the humiliation, and the realization that dozens of guests were now watching him began to twist into pure rage. He shot to his feet so violently that his chair crashed backward. Then he slammed both hands onto the table, knocking over crystal glasses and sending red wine splashing across Savannah's expensive white dress. "Are you trying to humiliate me?" he roared, jabbing a finger at the manager's face. "Do you have any idea who I am? I own the Caldwell Empire. I have $30 million in cash sitting in the bank. This is your stupid banking system's fault. Call the bank manager right now. If you don't, I'll buy this restaurant tomorrow morning and fire every one of you. I will ruin your life." Savannah jumped up and grabbed his sleeve. "Marcus, calm down," she hissed through clenched teeth, desperately trying to save face as guests around them started whispering and taking out their phones to record. "It's just a technical issue. Use one of our personal cards and let's settle this now." But Marcus didn't have a personal card capable of covering $200,000. Every dollar he had depended on that corporate card. He shoved Savannah's hand away and kept screaming at the restaurant staff, insulting them with the filthiest words he could think of. He blamed the system. He blamed the machines. He blamed anything and everything he could reach with his panic. He was shouting like an animal trapped in a corner. What he didn't know was that not far away in a filthy motel room on the outskirts of the city, I was sitting back and calmly sipping tea. On my laptop screen, a bright red notification confirmed that the asset freeze order had been successfully executed. Using my power as the primary creditor, I had frozen the entire financial system of Caldwell Foods. That black card had not malfunctioned. The bank had not made a mistake. The card had simply fulfilled its purpose, perfectly lulling them into a fantasy of power, then throwing them off a financial cliff. Their glorious celebration had officially collapsed, and this was only the appetizer. Right in the middle of Marcus screaming in the restaurant manager's face, Savannah's diamond-studded handbag suddenly began to ring. The shrill, frantic sound sliced through the tension like a knife. Annoyed, she yanked out her phone. The screen flashed the name David, the chief accountant of Caldwell Foods. He had worked for the company for 20 years and was one of the very few senior managers Savannah hadn't gotten around to firing that morning. She swiped to answer, her voice dripping with irritation and entitlement. "David, what on earth do you want at a time like this?" she snapped. "I'm in the middle of a party. Do not interrupt me unless it's important." But the voice on the other end was nothing like the obedient, respectful tone she was used to. David sounded terrified. His breathing was ragged, panicked. It was so loud through the speaker that Savannah's expression immediately tightened. He spoke fast, like a man being chased by disaster itself. "Miss Caldwell, something catastrophic has happened," he said. "We just received an emergency notice from the federal banking system. Every single Caldwell Foods account has been completely frozen." Savannah went still, her brows furrowed as she raised her voice, offended more than alarmed. "Frozen? What do you mean frozen? We have $30 million in cash in the bank. My mother left that money to me in front of our attorney. So whatever mistake your people made, fix it." On the other end, David nearly shouted in desperation. "There is no $30 million, he said. "There never was. Those were old paper figures, nothing more than accounting illusions. Every company asset has been frozen. The cash, the properties, the investment fund, everything. A federal enforcement order was just triggered by a creditor called VC Financial Group." Savannah looked as if someone had dumped a bucket of ice water straight over her head. Her lips parted, her face drained of color. "A creditor," she whispered. "That's impossible. Our family doesn't owe anyone anything." David's voice cracked. "Your mother mortgaged the entire company and every major property 10 years ago. There is no inheritance fund. There is no extra cash. There is only debt, $35 million of it. And the anonymous creditor activated full asset recovery tonight. Your cards are dead. Mr. Marcus's cards are dead. The company is officially insolvent. Caldwell Foods is bankrupt." The phone slowly slipped from Savannah's hand and smashed onto the floor. She stood frozen in place, her face so pale it looked bloodless. Her legs trembled so badly she could barely stay upright. Beside her, Marcus was still shouting at the restaurant manager, still threatening to buy the place, still acting like a newly crowned king. But Savannah knew the truth now. They were not rich. They had just signed their names to a financial death sentence, and their worst nightmare had only just begun. It took them less than 12 hours to find the hole I was hiding in. Before the all-powerful black card had been fully rejected by the federal banking system, Marcus had managed to swipe one last large payment to hire a private investigator. That investigator followed my taxi from downtown Chicago all the way to this miserable motel on the outskirts of the city. It was 9 o'clock the next morning. I was sitting on a cracked imitation leather sofa in the cramped lobby, sipping a weak cup of black coffee, when the quiet morning atmosphere was torn apart without warning. The motel's sliding glass doors burst open. Savannah stormed into the lobby like a woman possessed. She no longer looked like the queen who had been crowned the day before. Her expensive white designer dress was wrinkled and still stained with splashes of red wine from the disaster at the rooftop party. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her makeup had melted into streaks from crying and panic. Right behind her came Marcus. He looked like a wild animal backed into a corner. His dark blue suit was rumpled, and the collar still carried the stale smell of cheap cigar smoke mixed with sour sweat. They didn't even glance around the room. They marched straight to the front desk. Marcus slammed his huge hand down on the wooden counter so hard the young clerk jumped in fear. His voice came out rough and threatening as he demanded my room key immediately. He shouted that Vivian was a professional con artist, a dangerous financial criminal who had stolen $30 million from his family and was hiding in this rat hole. The terrified clerk stammered, stepped backward, and fumbled for the phone to call the police. I set my paper cup down on the low glass table in front of me. Then I rose slowly to my feet and smoothed the wrinkles from my gray slacks. I did not hurry. I did not flinch. My voice cut cleanly through their ridiculous chaos. "I'm right here," I said calmly. "There's no need to bother anyone else." Savannah and Marcus spun around so fast it was almost comical. The moment they saw me, their eyes lit up with pure hatred and desperation. They rushed toward me like lunatics. Savannah thrust a trembling, diamond-covered finger straight at my face and hissed through clenched teeth. She called me a vicious witch. She accused me of using underhanded technological tricks to freeze every bank account connected to the family. She screamed that I had to hand over the trust passwords immediately and return the $30 million Mother had left to her. Marcus stepped right into my space. He used the full size of his former athlete's body to try to physically intimidate me. He was breathing hard, and the stale smell of last night's champagne hung on him like rot. Through gritted teeth, he said he knew exactly what I had done. In his mind, I had secretly transferred the company's entire fortune into a hidden offshore account just before I was thrown out of the building the morning before. Then, in a fit of rage, he swung his arm and knocked over a plastic stand full of glossy travel brochures beside me, sending papers flying all across the lobby floor. "If you don't give me the access code right now," he snarled, "I'll tear you apart myself." He swore he would call the federal police. He swore he would have me dragged to prison for the rest of my life. Beside him, Savannah was falling apart. She kept crying about how every one of her credit cards had been declined when she tried to pay the hotel bill. She wailed that her rich friends were laughing at her, that the Caldwell family name was being destroyed because of my petty jealousy, and I stood there with my arms folded watching them perform. It was almost funny. These two people had called themselves the rulers of an empire, yet here they were behaving like gutter thugs in a cheap motel lobby. They were too stupid and too arrogant to understand the truth standing right in front of them. They were still clinging to the fantasy that the $30 million had been real and that I had stolen it. They had no idea that the money had never existed. It had only been an illusion one my mother had built to hide a black hole of debt. They had come charging in here like debt collectors, but in reality, they were the debt. And now they were screaming for money from the one person in the world who truly owned them. I didn't offer a single word of explanation. I simply stood there in silence and watched them thrash inside the web their own greed had spun. Marcus shoved a hand into the inside pocket of his wrinkled suit jacket and pulled out a crumpled stack of papers. Then he slammed them down onto the small glass table in front of me. 2 legal documents. One was a confidentiality agreement. The other was a full financial power of attorney. He planted both hands on the table, leaned toward me, his face burning red with rage, and growled that the game was over. If I knew what was good for me, I would hand over the PIN code to the hidden offshore account immediately. He threatened that if I refused by morning, every newspaper in America would be flooded with headlines about how the former executive of Caldwell Foods had embezzled company funds. He kept pounding his fist against the table, each blow cracking through the quiet motel lobby. He swore he would use every contact he had to drag me into court. He painted a picture of me wearing a prison uniform, rotting away in a freezing cell until the day I died. Anyone watching the scene would have boiled with anger at the sheer hypocrisy of it. For 30 years, I had poured my strength and my personal money into saving a company that had been rotting from the inside because of my mother's and sister's reckless spending. I kept the Caldwell empire standing while they bought racehorses and yachts. And now, after stealing the throne, they were calling me the thief. Savannah stood beside her husband with her arms folded, her face twisted with hatred and contempt. She joined in immediately, hissing that I was pathetic. She accused me of being jealous because Mother had left everything to her and that this was my disgusting little revenge. She was convinced I had secretly transferred the family's $30 million into a private black fund and then hired hackers to lock down the company's servers. She said I couldn't fool her or Marcus because they were people of the elite world. I looked at the 2 lunatics standing in front of me. They truly believed the $30 million had been real. They truly believed I had hidden it. They were too arrogant and too ignorant to understand what a federal asset seizure order actually meant. They had no idea that the Caldwell family had been bankrupt for 10 years and had only survived on borrowed capital from an anonymous financial corporation. And I was the owner of that anonymous corporation. They had stormed in here like debt collectors. But in truth, they were nothing more than desperate debtors screaming in the face of the one creditor who actually owned them. Marcus tossed a cheap plastic pen onto the table. Then he jabbed a thick finger at the blank line on the power of attorney form. He ordered me to sign immediately and transfer control of all my personal accounts to him. With a smug little laugh, he promised that if I obediently handed over the $30 million, he wouldn't call the police. He even had the nerve to say that out of mercy, he might arrange for me to receive $3,000 a month from the company fund so I could finish out my miserable final years in some cheap nursing home. He presented that insulting scrap of charity as though it were a royal gift, something I should fall to my knees and thank him for. Their cruelty had sunk to the very bottom of human decency. But I wasn't angry. The only thing inside me now was absolute stillness. I stared at the confidentiality agreement and the power of attorney form. They had no idea these papers held no power to save them. In fact, if I signed them, I would be transferring the last remaining legal contamination straight on to Savannah. They were tightening the rope around their own necks with their own hands, and I knew exactly what I needed to do next, so I leaned back slightly on the sofa, and I began to perform. I let my hands tremble just a little. I lowered my head and avoided their eyes. I drew in a shaky breath, pretending I was a broken old woman crushed beneath family pressure and terrified by Marcus's threats of prison and public disgrace. Then very slowly, I reached out and picked up the pen. I picked up the cheap plastic pen from the table. I made sure my fingers trembled. I bit down on my lower lip and forced the expression of an exhausted old woman cornered by fear and desperation. The hardest part was not pretending to be terrified. The hardest part was stopping myself from laughing in their faces. They had brought me a termination and full waiver agreement. In their minds, this document would stop me from ever suing them to reclaim the company. But they had been too arrogant to ask a real lawyer to examine the language carefully. My eyes skimmed the tiny printed lines. The wording was beautifully clear. The moment I signed, I would officially have no further legal connection, no ownership interest, and no management responsibility whatsoever for Caldwell Foods, which meant Savannah's sole heir and legal successor would absorb 100% of every legal liability and every debt tied to the corporation. They were cutting away their own final lifeline and handing me a perfect legal shield. Marcus saw my trembling hands and grew even more smug. He folded his arms across his chest, smirked, and told me to hurry up and sign. He said I had no choice left. Again, he threatened that the police were already waiting outside, and that if I delayed for even one more second, he would have me dragged away in handcuffs. Savannah stood beside him with a victorious little smile curling across her face. She pushed back her messy blonde hair and said in the tone of a queen granting mercy that if I signed without causing trouble, she might choose not to pursue the $30 million I had supposedly hidden. I drew in a long breath. Then I closed my eyes as if surrendering to a tragic fate, and I put the pen to the paper. I signed my name slowly, shakily, on both documents. With every stroke of ink, another crushing burden slipped from my shoulders. For 30 years, I had personally guaranteed loan after loan just to keep this rotten family from collapsing under its own greed. And now, because of Marcus's own bullying and stupidity, I was finally clean. I slid the signed papers back across the table. Marcus lunged for them like a starving animal grabbing raw meat. He held them up, checked my signature with greedy, glittering eyes, and let out a wild laugh. Then he slapped Savannah on the shoulder and declared that they had won big. In his mind, they now had total, irreversible control, and I would never again be able to interfere with their luxury life. They carefully folded the documents and tucked them inside Savannah's expensive handbag. Then they gave me one final look of contempt before turning and walking out of the motel lobby. Marcus even shouted for the front desk clerk and tossed him a $20 bill to clean up the brochures he had knocked over earlier. Then the two of them strutted through the sliding glass doors with all the arrogance of victors leaving a battlefield. They thought they had just ended my life, but in truth, they had just hammered the final nail into their own financial coffin. I remained on the worn sofa watching their backs disappear, and I smiled. The performance was over. Now it was time for reality to speak. The moment the motel's sliding glass doors shut behind them, I slowly let the mask of a helpless old woman fall away. The trembling in my hands vanished instantly. Through the fogged glass, I watched them cross the parking lot in total triumph. Marcus was whistling some dull little tune, and Savannah strutted beside him in her expensive heels, clutching those two thin sheets of paper like they were royal protection from the consequences closing in around them. They truly believed those documents had saved them. They had no idea those same papers were the most perfect indictment of their stupidity and greed. By forcing me to surrender every right and every responsibility, Savannah had also agreed to carry 100% of the $35 million debt with no legal shield left between her and the fire. I opened my worn leather handbag with slow, deliberate care. I did not reach for the cheap phone I usually use to endure the family's insults. Instead, I pulled out a black satellite phone fitted with high-level encrypted security. This was the line I used only for one purpose: to run the anonymous financial empire that truly controlled everything. I dialed a long string of numbers and lifted the cold device to my ear. It rang once, only once. Then Harrison answered. His voice was calm, cautious, and ready, waiting for my instructions. The fish swallowed the hook whole. "Mr. Harrison," I said, my tone low and razor sharp. "They came here themselves and forced me to sign away every remaining right and every last responsibility tied to Caldwell Foods. The final legal shield is gone. They've locked themselves inside the cage." On the other end, Harrison cleared his throat softly. He confirmed that every legal filing, every debt record, and every asset freeze order had been finalized and was already waiting on his desk. Then he asked me how I wanted the final move executed. I looked out through the motel window toward the broken suburban road, just in time to see Marcus's sports car roar away, carrying with it the last of their delusions. Activate everything I said. Release the emergency federal debt summons immediately. Have one delivered to company headquarters first thing tomorrow morning, and make sure every board member and every outstanding creditor receives notice of an extraordinary meeting. I paused. Then I gave the order that would close the trap forever. It's time to get them all into one room and lock the door. I ended the call and slipped the satellite phone back into my bag. A deep, absolute stillness settled over me. Not fear, not grief, not patience. Power. The begging was over. The pretending was over. The humiliation, the exploitation, the decades of being used and dismissed, they were over too. Tomorrow morning, in the very same conference room where they had celebrated stripping everything from me, they would face a financial death sentence. They were about to be crushed by the very laws and numbers they had always treated like beneath them. The pressure inside the machine had finally reached its breaking point, and I was ready to lift the lid. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, I walked into Caldwell Foods headquarters. No one at reception dared stop me. They were still too shaken by the news that the company's assets had been frozen overnight. I went straight to the top floor and stepped into the massive glass-walled boardroom. It was already packed. Nearly 50 people filled the room, seated around the long oak conference table or lined up against the glass walls. Board members, major shareholders, representatives from the lending banks, senior suppliers from our largest beef contracts. The air was thick with tension, confusion, and angry whispers. I did not walk to this chair at the head of the table. Instead, I quietly chose an empty seat in the farthest corner of the room, sat down, poured myself a cup of hot jasmine tea, and took a small sip. Then I waited for the final act to begin. 15 minutes later, the double doors swung open. Savannah and Marcus entered. They tried to look powerful, controlled, untouchable. But I could see the panic buried beneath the heavy makeup and expensive clothes. Savannah wore a white Chanel suit that radiated wealth, but her steps were slightly uneven. Marcus stayed close behind her, his eyes sweeping the room, measuring the mood, trying to look intimidating by stretching his broad frame to its full size. They walked straight to the head of the table. Savannah dropped her expensive handbag onto the polished wood with a sharp thud, forcing every eye in the room onto her. The whispers died instantly. Every face turned toward the woman who had just been declared the sole heir to the Caldwell empire. The creditors and shareholders were all waiting for one thing, an explanation for why the entire financial system of the company had been frozen only hours after she took power. Savannah stood up straight and threw her blonde hair back over her shoulder. She did not look ashamed. She did not look frightened. Instead, she stepped forward and played the role of the innocent victim and the strong new leader. Her sharp voice rang across the room. "The Caldwell family is facing an unprecedented crisis," she announced. "But let me make one thing absolutely clear. This crisis was not caused by me, and it was not caused by my late mother." Then she pointed directly toward the corner where I sat quietly with my tea. "It was caused by Vivian." Every powerful man and woman in that room turned to look at me. I simply took another calm sip of tea, and Savannah kept going. She unleashed the most disgusting lies she could think of. She told the board that for 30 years I had abused the family's trust and secretly siphoned money out of supplier contracts. She accused me of setting up shell companies to move tens of millions of dollars offshore. She claimed I had known in advance that Mother would leave everything to her, so I had used dirty financial tricks to sabotage the company out of revenge. Marcus stood beside her, nodding with theatrical outrage, slamming his hand down onto the table for emphasis. He claimed that he and Savannah had just uncovered a long trail of serious accounting irregularities that I had supposedly left behind. Then he took it even further. He declared that the $35 million debt hanging over Caldwell Foods was actually the result of illegal loans I had secretly arranged in Beatrice's name while she was weak and ill. He urged the banks and the shareholders to unite with them and send me to prison. He even promised without a shred of proof that once I was removed, the $30 million I had stolen would somehow be recovered and the company would return to normal. The shamelessness was breathtaking. They were trying to turn the full fury of the room onto me. The whispers started rising again. A few of the banking representatives actually looked tempted to believe them. One elderly shareholder shot to his feet, his face red with anger, and demanded that I explain myself immediately. He said that if Savannah's accusations were true, then I was the greatest traitor the Caldwell family had ever seen. Then others joined in. Their voices grew louder. Their accusations grew uglier. They had already forgotten that I was the one who had brought them their fattest contracts for decades. They had already forgotten who kept the machine running while they collected profits and applause. It was amazing how quickly people could believe a polished lie when it came from someone dressed like power. I set my jasmine teacup down onto its saucer. The soft little click echoed in my ears like a signal. I looked straight at Savannah. Her face was glowing with reckless triumph. She truly believed that turning me into a scapegoat in front of the most powerful people in the city would save her from financial execution. She thought cheap lies could overpower federal legal filings. She and Marcus had dug themselves into a very deep hole, and now they were inviting everyone else to jump in after them. But I said nothing. I did not defend myself. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply sat there, folded my hands, and remained silent, because I knew the fire inside this pressure cooker needed to rise just a little higher before I poured ice-cold truth all over them. Marcus stepped forward and pointed his thick, clumsy finger straight at me. Standing in the center of that massive boardroom, he launched into a public humiliation in front of 50 of the most powerful people connected to the company. He called me a parasite, a bloodsucker. He shouted that I had clung to Beatrice's pity for 30 years, and the moment I realized I would not receive a single dollar from the $30 million estate, I had spitefully sabotaged the company's financial system. He paced around the table, flinging his arms like some oversized thug trying to dominate the room. Then he told the shareholders that I was nothing more than a bitter employee, an old, lonely woman with no family of her own, so consumed by jealousy that I had turned all my resentment against my perfect younger sister. Murmurs spread through the room. A few of the bank representatives even nodded, as if Marcus's confidence alone made his lies sound believable. They looked at me with suspicion, contempt, and cold curiosity. They were completely fooled by the polished appearance of Savannah and her husband. None of them knew the explosive truth that had been buried for years. The truth was, this Caldwell Foods had stood on the edge of bankruptcy not once, but 3 different times. The first was in 2008 when the market collapsed. The second was in 2014 after my mother's disastrous real estate investments. And the third was only 5 years ago. Every single time my mother called me in absolute panic, crying, begging, pleading for me to save the family name before it collapsed in public. And every single time, I stepped in. I used the enormous profits from my own secret personal investment portfolios to pour money back into the company. I personally filled the financial holes that my mother's and Savannah's reckless spending had ripped open. But because of a foolish sense of duty, and because I still wanted to preserve the last scraps of dignity for my proud, arrogant mother, I allowed her name to appear on every official capital infusion. So on paper, Beatrice Caldwell always looked like the great savior, the matriarch, the genius, the woman who rode in with money and rescued the empire. And me, I stayed in the shadows, cleaning up the wreckage, in silence. That blind arrangement was exactly why Savannah and Marcus had grown up believing my mother was a brilliant business mastermind with endless wealth. They looked at doctored statements and polished reports and convinced themselves that I was just a puppet, a talentless employee living off the generosity of the family. They could never imagine the truth. They could never imagine that every drop of blood still pumping through that company had come from my veins. Marcus was still shouting. He slammed his palm onto the oak table and demanded that I stand up, bow my head, confess my crimes, and hand over the access codes to the bank accounts. In front of the shareholders, he swore he would never allow some senile old woman to destroy the future of a great corporation. He called me garbage from the past. Savannah stood beside him with her arms folded, her bright red lips curved into a smug little smile. She was enjoying every second of my humiliation in front of that room, and I remained exactly where I was, still, silent, unmoved. I let Marcus's worst insults crash against me without reacting. I looked at the faces turning against me, people siding with thieves while condemning the one person who had actually protected their livelihood for decades. The louder Marcus became, the calmer I felt, because every lie he told was digging his grave deeper. He had no idea that every insult leaving his mouth was about to become a knife driven straight back into his own throat. I slowly closed my eyes, drew in one deep breath, and waited patiently for the most important guest of the meeting to arrive. Top of form, bottom of form. The whispers in the boardroom slowly transformed into a real wave of outrage. Marcus and Savannah's lies had completely poisoned the minds of the 50 people in that room. Then the chairman of the board, an older man with a full head of white hair, rose slowly to his feet. He cleared his throat and tapped his fountain pen against the table to restore order. When he looked at me, his expression was filled with utter disappointment, and the judgment in his eyes was merciless. He said Caldwell Foods had always treated me like family, but what I had done was an unforgivable betrayal. He declared that the board could not tolerate a woman who had embezzled company funds and sabotaged Beatrice Caldwell's legacy. Then, in a loud, formal voice, he proposed an emergency vote on the spot. The motion was simple. I was to be permanently expelled from every activity connected to the corporation, and Savannah and Marcus were to receive full authority to sue me in federal court. Marcus smirked with satisfaction. He folded his arms across his chest and gave the chairman a small, approving nod. Savannah crossed her long legs, took a delicate sip of water, and sat there like a queen waiting to watch her enemy be executed. The chairman raised his voice and instructed everyone in favor of expelling Vivian and authorizing legal action against her to raise their hands. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Then one by one the hands began to rise. First the bank representatives, the men desperate to recover their money, then the major shareholders, the ones who worshipped profit and reputation above everything else. One after another, more arms lifted into the air against me. 10 hands, 20 hands, 40 hands. Almost everyone in the room raised a hand in support of destroying me. Anyone watching that moment would have burned with rage at the sheer injustice of it. A woman who had sacrificed her youth to save this company was now being handed over to the wolves by the very people who owed their fortunes to her work. The chairman nodded with satisfaction. He cleared his throat, ready to announce the result and drive the final nail into my coffin. Marcus stepped forward eagerly, practically trembling with anticipation. He already had that mocking smile prepared, the one he planned to throw in my face the moment my fate was sealed. But just as the chairman opened his mouth to speak, a thunderous sound exploded through the room. The heavy oak double doors were shoved open from the outside. They slammed against the glass wall with such force that the entire boardroom shook. The tension shattered instantly. All 50 heads turned toward the entrance at once. The raised hands began to lower in stunned confusion. Mr. Harrison walked in. The 64-year-old attorney no longer wore his usual calm, measured expression. His steps were firm, sharp, powerful. In one hand, he carried a black leather briefcase stuffed with documents deadly enough to destroy lives. But what made the entire room stop breathing was not Harrison's sudden entrance. It was the 2 men walking directly behind him. They were dressed in black suits, their faces cold and unreadable. On their jackets were the insignias of the Federal Financial Audit Authority. and everyone in that room knew exactly what that meant. When men like that appeared inside a company, it only ever meant one thing: a financial disaster beyond repair was about to be exposed. Marcus frowned. The smile vanished from his face. He stepped forward and demanded to know what Harrison thought he was doing. He barked at the old lawyer, asking why he had brought outsiders into a private Caldwell family meeting. He insisted that the vote had already finished and that I had officially been thrown out. Harrison stopped at the head of the table directly across from Marcus and Savannah. The two federal auditors stepped to either side of him, forming a wall of steel. The room dropped into total silence. No one dared whisper. No one dared defend Savannah anymore. Then Harrison slowly opened his briefcase. "This vote is completely invalid," he said. His voice was deep, controlled, and heavy enough to crush every ounce of arrogance in the room. "No one in this room," he continued, "including Ms. Savannah Caldwell, has the authority to vote anyone out of this building, because the person holding ultimate power of life and death over Caldwell Foods is not the woman standing at the head of this table." Then Harrison reached into the case and pulled out a sealed, dark red envelope. It was not the ordinary will. It was the secret addendum, a single document my mother had spent years hiding from everyone. Savannah's eyes twitched. She took a small step backward, both hands gripping the edge of the oak table so tightly her knuckles turned white. A terrible realization had begun to rise inside her. The pressure cooker had been locked shut, and this was the exact moment the legal bomb was about to explode. Top of form, bottom of form. Mr. Harrison straightened to his full height and swept a cold, cutting gaze across the stunned faces in the boardroom. Then he cleared his throat once more and spoke. His voice rang out through the vast room, sharp, commanding, impossible to ignore. "This vote is completely invalid, ladies and gentlemen, because the person who truly holds the power of life and death in this room, the power to decide who stays and who goes, is not Ms. Savannah Caldwell." His words fell like slabs of stone, shattering the arrogant illusion that had wrapped itself around everyone in that room. The chairman of the board frowned in confusion and stammered out a question, asking Mr. Harrison what exactly he meant. Marcus opened his mouth, ready to explode into another tirade, but the icy stare of the two federal auditors pinned him in place. For the first time all morning, he said nothing. Savannah, however, began to tremble. No layer of expensive makeup could hide the color draining from her face. Slowly, Harrison reached into his black leather briefcase. He did not pull out an ordinary stack of legal papers. Instead, he drew out a sealed envelope marked with dark red wax, the color of danger, the color of warning, the color of a deadly secret. "This," he said, holding it between his fingers, "is the secret addendum to the will. A supreme legal instrument your mother went to extraordinary lengths to hide for more than 10 years. Then he raised the envelope high beneath the crystal lights so that all 50 people in the room could see it clearly. Savannah's eye twitched. She stumbled back one step and gripped the edge of the oak table so tightly her knuckles turned white. Every last trace of her ridiculous pride had vanished. In its place was something far more honest: terror. The pressure cooker was sealed shut now. Every exit had been locked, and this was the exact moment the legal bomb was about to explode and burn their entire fantasy empire to the ground. Top of form, bottom of form. Mr. Harrison carefully pressed his thumb against the dark red wax seal on the envelope and broke it open. The sharp crack of the wax splintering echoed through the suffocating silence of the boardroom. All 50 people held their breath. Slowly, he pulled out a sheet of pale yellow parchment and smoothed it flat across the oak table. The two federal auditors stepped forward and stood directly behind him, their posture rigid, ready to act. Then Harrison looked up at Savannah. There was pity in his eyes, but there was also the coldness of a man speaking on behalf of the law. He cleared his throat and began reading the contents of the secret addendum. His voice was clear, slow, and deliberate, making sure every word carved itself into the minds of everyone in that room. "The $30 million everyone here has been fighting over," he said, "is nothing more than an illusion. It is a fabricated figure kept on the books to mislead shareholders and business partners. The truth is that Caldwell Foods ran out of liquid cash 10 years ago. A shockwave rippled through the room. He continued. Mrs. Beatrice Caldwell's extravagant lifestyle, her luxury trips through Europe, her thoroughbred racehorses, and the millions spent funding Savannah Caldwell's elite social life drained the company of its last drop of blood. Then came the fatal blow. To avoid declaring bankruptcy and suffering public humiliation before Chicago society, Mrs. Caldwell made a desperate decision. 10 years ago, she secretly mortgaged the entirety of Caldwell Foods, every meatpacking facility, every piece of commercial real estate, the Malibu estate, even the family brand itself. The room went dead quiet. She signed a private financing agreement with an anonymous financial institution known as VC Group. The amount borrowed was not small. It was $35 million. Savannah staggered backward. Her expensive heels nearly buckled beneath her. Her mouth fell open, but no sound came out. Marcus stared at Harrison, and for the first time sweat began to bead across his forehead. Around the table, the chairman and the shareholders started murmuring in disbelief. They were finally beginning to understand that the mighty empire they had been clawing at was nothing but a hollow shell balanced over a black hole of debt. But Harrison was not finished. He lifted the page slightly and continued, each sentence landing like a hammer strike. Under state inheritance law, when an heir knowingly accepts an estate that is under active collateral obligation, that heir does not merely inherit the assets. They also inherit full legal responsibility for the debt attached to those assets. Then he turned his gaze directly to Savannah. And on Monday morning, Ms. Savannah Caldwell voluntarily signed 3 separate documents waiving independent audit review in order to seize immediate and absolute control of the estate. Savannah's face drained even further. Harrison's voice turned colder. Those signatures are fully valid. Ms. Caldwell is now the sole personal guarantor of VC Group's $35 million debt. Worse still, her immediate dismissal of senior management and her use of corporate credit facilities for private celebrations constitute material violations of the financial safety covenants in the lending agreement. That was when the federal auditors finally spoke. One of them stepped forward and pulled out a thick file stamped with red court markings. In a flat mechanical voice, he announced, VC Group has formally petitioned for emergency debt enforcement. Effective immediately, all assets held under the Caldwell family name are now subject to seizure by VC Group. If liquidation of those assets fails to satisfy the full $35 million balance, Ms. Savannah Caldwell will remain personally liable for the remaining debt for the rest of her life. The room exploded. Bank representatives physically moved away from Savannah as though she were carrying a contagious disease. Major shareholders began shouting that Beatrice Caldwell had deceived them for an entire decade. The throne Savannah had climbed onto had turned into an electric chair before it even had time to grow warm. She had not inherited $30 million. She had inherited a permanent sentence of financial ruin. Marcus stood frozen. The face of the arrogant man who had strutted through this room only minutes earlier was now ghost white. Not a trace of blood remained in it. He was breathing hard, eyes wide and feverish. Then he slammed both hands onto the table so violently the porcelain teacups rattled. And finally, he screamed. His voice was hoarse, cracking with panic and fury. "Who owns VC Group?" he shouted at Harrison. "Who the hell are they? And why are they doing this to us?" The pressure cooker had exploded, and now every horrified eye in that room was searching for the identity of the one person powerful enough to hold the entire Caldwell empire by the throat. Top of form, bottom of form. Chaos instantly swallowed the oak boardroom whole. Savannah completely lost control. She grabbed her head with both hands and started screaming like a spoiled child whose favorite toy had just been ripped away. She pointed at Mr. Harrison's face and shrieked through clenched teeth, demanding to know who the hell this miserable VC financial group really was. Then she ordered the board to use company funds immediately to hire the most expensive lawyers in New York and drag them all the way to the Supreme Court. In her frenzy, she kept insisting that no anonymous force on earth had the right to take Caldwell Foods away from her. Marcus joined in at once. He slammed his fist onto the table so hard he knocked over a water pitcher. Then he jabbed a finger at the federal auditors and started shouting threats. He boasted that his family knew powerful politicians and that he would never allow anyone to touch a single cent of the $30 million he still foolishly believed belonged to him. He ranted that the mortgage agreement from 10 years ago had to be some elaborate fraud, that they were the victims of a vicious conspiracy designed to steal their fortune. Around the room, bank representatives and shareholders began whispering furiously to one another. They were just as desperate to know who VC Financial Group really was. Who could seize the entire Caldwell empire so cleanly, so ruthlessly? Some muttered that it had to be a ruthless Wall Street fund specializing in swallowing bankrupt companies whole. Others guessed it was an old business rival finally moving in for the kill. I remained seated in the corner for 1 minute longer. I wanted their panic to reach its absolute peak. Then I rose. There was no trembling in me now, none of the weakness I had performed back at the motel. I lifted a hand, slowly removed my reading glasses, and laid them carefully on the table. The small sound of glass touching glass was almost delicate, yet it instantly drew the attention of everyone nearby. The room began to fall silent. One by one, heads turned as I picked up my old leather bag and walked calmly toward the head of the table where Savannah and Marcus stood. Savannah recoiled a step and glared at me with naked hatred. She hissed that I was worthless and ordered me to get out. I ignored her completely. I walked straight to the room's central control podium. Then I opened my worn leather bag and pulled out the silver laptop Marcus had dented when he hurled it to the floor the day before. Calmly, I powered it on and connected a cable to the massive projection system built into the room. The giant screen on the wall flickered for a few seconds, then came alive. What appeared was not a fake balance sheet, not a staffing chart, not one of Savannah's pathetic leadership announcements. It was a federal business registration certificate, a legal document bearing an embossed gold government seal proving the lawful ownership of a limited liability corporation. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat and stepped back, giving the floor to me. I turned to face Savannah, looked directly into her widening eyes, and spoke in a voice so calm it cut sharper than any scream ever could. "You want to sue VC Financial Group, little sister," I said. "Then you can serve the lawsuit directly to me. Right here, in this room." Then I pressed one key. The registration certificate expanded tenfold across the giant screen until it filled the entire wall. Every person in that room stared up in silence. There it was in bold black letters. Owner VC Financial Group. Founder and sole shareholder Vivian Caldwell. The initials of my own name had become the name of the anonymous empire. I was VC. I was the one who had quietly pumped $35 million of my own money into Caldwell Foods 10 years earlier to keep it from collapsing. And I was the one and only supreme creditor of the entire family. The truth hit the room like an explosion. Everything froze. Shareholders sat there with their mouths hanging open, unable to believe what they were seeing. The chairman of the board slowly removed his glasses, his hand visibly shaking. In that instant, they all realized what they had almost done. They had nearly voted to throw out the savior of the company, the real owner of the debt, the real power in the building they were standing in. Savannah went completely still, her eyes stretched wide as she stared at the name Vivian Caldwell blazing across the screen. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Marcus staggered backward until his spine slammed into the glass wall behind him. He was breathing hard, his face drained so white it looked bloodless. They had mocked me as a poor old woman. They had thrown me out of the penthouse. They had used dirty legal tricks to force me to sign away my rights. And now, in this very moment, they realized they had delivered their lives into the hands of the woman they had spent days trying to humiliate. I smiled, a cold smile, a smile filled with absolute power. "Thank you, my dear sister," I said slowly, carefully, letting every word echo through the stunned silence of the room. "Thank you for so willingly taking the full $35 million debt off my shoulders yesterday. The penthouse, the factories, and even the chairman's seat you're standing next to have belonged to me for 10 years already. Then I looked straight at Savannah and finished the sentence that shattered what little remained of her world. "And you, Savannah, are officially bankrupt." The brutal truth finally pierced Savannah's slow, sheltered mind. She stumbled back another step, her expensive heels catching on the leg of a leather chair, and collapsed hard onto the carpet. Those 3 signatures she had scribbled so proudly and so carelessly on Monday morning were never the documents for receiving $30 million. They were a financial death sentence. They were her voluntary acceptance of the entire $35 million debt, along with every savage layer of interest that had piled up over the last 10 years. There was no legal escape left for her now. And the waiver she and her husband had forced me to sign in the motel lobby the day before had done exactly what they were too stupid to understand. It had severed every remaining obligation from me and chained her to that black hole of debt forever. Savannah let out a piercing scream like an animal being dragged to slaughter. The sound tore through the boardroom and crashed against the cold glass walls. She clutched her head with both hands, wildly ripping apart the flawless blonde hair that had been sprayed into place only hours before. She slammed both fists down onto the oak table so hard that several of her diamond-studded nails snapped. She sobbed, screamed for her mother, then turned and cursed me with the ugliest, most desperate words she could find. But not one of the 50 powerful people in that room stepped forward to comfort her. The bank representatives and shareholders only moved farther away, staring at her with cold disgust. But the cruelest betrayal did not come from the law. It came from the man standing right beside her. Marcus, the same man who minutes earlier had called himself a king, had now become what he truly was, a cowardly rat cornered by reality. The color drained from the former athlete's face. His lips trembled. He looked at Savannah sobbing on the floor, then looked up at my name blazing across the projector screen. Panic turned to rage, violent rage. Marcus lunged forward, but not to help his wife. He grabbed Savannah by the collar of her expensive Chanel dress and yanked her upward. Through clenched teeth, he spat the filthiest insults at her right in front of everyone. He called her an idiot, a failure, a useless fool who had dragged him into this swamp. He shouted that he had wasted 10 years of his life serving an empty family and that he would never allow his personal credit to be destroyed because of her stupidity. Then he swore he would call his lawyer that very afternoon and file for divorce, leaving her to drown in the mountain of debt alone. The love built on black credit cards and fantasies of power shattered on the spot. Savannah grabbed at Marcus's sleeve, crying and begging him not to leave her. He flung her off. She crashed back onto the marble floor. Just yesterday, the two of them had stood side by side, mocking me, humiliating me, and throwing me out into the street. Now, in front of shareholders, creditors, and business partners, they were tearing each other apart like starving animals. And I stood there with my arms folded calmly, watching the final act. No further accusation was necessary. The harshest sentence had already been carried out by their own greed, their own betrayal, and the rot inside their own souls. The pressure cooker had exploded, and it left behind nothing but ashes. Top of form, bottom of form. I gave Mr. Harrison a small nod. He raised his hand and pressed a button on the remote, hidden inside his suit pocket. The boardroom doors opened once again. 4 large men in black security uniforms stepped inside. They were not members of the building's internal security team, the kind Savannah could still try to order around. They were elite private security officers I had personally hired the afternoon before, and they answered to one person, only the owner of VC Financial Group. I tilted my head toward the 2 wrecks collapsing on the floor. "Escort these 2 uninvited guests out of the building immediately," I said to the security chief, my voice cold and final. "They no longer have any business here." Savannah scrambled up in panic. Her trembling hands lunged for the expensive designer handbag still sitting on the table, but before her fingers could touch the strap, one of the guards stepped forward and blocked her. I walked over and looked down at her without emotion. "That bag was purchased with a Caldwell Foods corporate card," I said. "And since this company is now under asset liquidation, anything bought with its money belongs to VC." She burst into tears and screamed that it was her personal property. I answered without changing expression. The only personal property you are allowed to leave this building with is the clothing you're wearing. Even that 10-carat diamond ring on your hand was bought with embezzled company funds, but I'll allow you to keep it until the court sends the seizure order next week." Savannah let out a broken sob. 2 guards took her by the arms and dragged her from the oak-paneled boardroom while the entire board watched with open contempt. Marcus, however, did not go so quietly. He snarled, cursed, and thrashed against the guards, trying to restrain him. He kept shouting that he would come back and kill everyone in the room. Then he stormed toward the elevators with long, furious strides, abandoning his sobbing wife without a second glance. He still believed that even if the company was gone, he could walk out, call a cab, and run from the wreckage. But he was wrong. When the elevator doors opened into the main lobby, Marcus did not see freedom. He saw flashing red and blue lights reflecting across the revolving glass doors. 2 police cars were waiting outside, and 3 police officers were already standing there. Marcus froze. He turned sharply, looking for another way out, but the private security team had already sealed every exit behind him. One of the officers stepped forward and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. Then, in a clear official voice, he read the arrest warrant. Marcus was being charged with financial fraud and unlawful use of corporate assets. His use of a black company credit card, while the company was already under an asset freeze, to spend $200,000 on a private celebration and buy expensive watches for his friends, qualified as felony theft. Marcus's mouth dropped open. He tried to explain that he was family, that he was married to the chairwoman, that this was all some misunderstanding in the accounting. No one listened. The handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists with a hard, cold click. Then 2 officers shoved his head down and forced him into the back seat of the patrol car. Savannah stood trembling on the cold Chicago sidewalk. Her expensive dress was wrinkled, filthy, and covered in dust. She had no handbag, no phone, not even enough money to call a taxi. She stood there alone, watching the police car speed away with sirens screaming, carrying off the husband who had just abandoned her. They had once believed they had everything: power, money, control. They had laughed while destroying my dignity and mocking the work I had given 30 years of my life to build. And now they were exactly what they had made me out to be: homeless, ruined, and drowning under a $35 million debt they would never repay in a lifetime. Justice had landed with perfect precision. Not one word too much, not one word too little. A week after everything happened, I was sitting aboard a private jet cruising 10,000 meters above the Atlantic Ocean. My destination was Paris. Through the small window beside me, I watched soft white clouds drift beneath the wing. In my hand was a crystal glass of perfectly chilled champagne. There were no more shrill phone calls from my mother demanding money. No more bitter accusations or endless ridiculous demands from my greedy little sister. No more arrogant brother-in-law circling like a parasite waiting for his next free meal. All of that noise, all of that poison had been left behind forever, along with the name Caldwell Foods. I took a slow sip and felt absolute peace moving through my veins. At 58 years old, I was finally living for myself. I had sold off every property and factory that had been liquidated, recovered the full $35 million in cash, and walked away with an enormous profit on top of it. Savannah and Marcus were now drowning in lawsuits from banks and business partners. They had been thrown out of the luxury apartment and were barely surviving, facing penalties severe enough to crush what little was left of their lives. After 30 years of working myself to the bone, denying myself comfort, just to carry an entire family on my back, I had finally learned one brutal truth. Family should never be an excuse for exploitation. The people who talk the most about family loyalty are often the first ones willing to sell you out for a check. Money may not be able to buy true happiness, but it can absolutely buy the best legal team in Chicago. It can buy freedom, it can buy respect, and it can buy your right to cut every toxic person out of your life without explaining yourself to anyone. That was my story. The story of a woman who used nothing but calm patience and cold legal documents to reclaim 30 stolen years of her life. And what about you? Have you ever had to become ruthless to protect your work, your dignity, and your peace from the greed of people who called themselves family? Did you choose to stay silent and endure it? Or did you stand up and use the law to teach them a lesson they would never forget? Tell me your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and if this story gave you the strength to start setting your own boundaries, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next video. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. And always remember this: your worth is never defined by people who were never capable of valuing it.